She asked for $9 million and the ranch my grandfather built with his bare hands. She thought she had me cornered in that courtroom, holding my life hostage with a stack of legal papers. She didn't know I'd spent the last 30 days rebuilding my entire reality. When I finally signed the divorce papers, she smiled like she had won the lottery. She had no idea that her signature just triggered a trap that would leave her with absolutely nothing. My wife told a judge she built my life and deserved half of it. She sat there in a courtroom that smelled like floor wax and old lies, asking for $9 million, my company, and the Texas ranch my grandfather staked in 1952. I looked her in the eye and saw nothing of the woman I had married 20 years ago. Everyone in that room thought I had just surrendered when I nodded along to her lawyer's demands. They did not see the other half of the board. You can win on paper and still lose in reality, and most folks learn that lesson too late. I did not. While she was counting my excavators and contracts, I was counting moves. 2 signatures, 1 trust, and a corporate structure she had never heard of turned her payday into a problem. But before I could spring the trap, I had to survive the betrayal that started it all. I started with a rusted Ford, a borrowed toolbox, and a promise I made to myself the day my dad died. Be the man who shows up. I took every job no one wanted. Fixing cracked driveways, hauling debris, pouring concrete in August heat that bent the horizon. 1 client turned into 3, 3 into a dozen. I learned to bid fair, pay on Fridays, and shake hands like it meant something. We grew into steel frames and shopping centers, then hospitals and schools, 45 employees, and multi-million-dollar contracts. What never changed was the ritual. Coffee at 5:30 in the morning, boots on by 6, a quiet prayer for clear heads and no injuries. That morning rhythm built my life piece by piece, and I believe the foundation was solid until I noticed hairline cracks where I never expected them, right at my own kitchen table. Our ranch sits where the Texas sky swallows the road. Panhandle wind hums through barbed wire, and dust lifts in long ribbons behind a truck. My grandfather staked that land in 1952. My father taught me to drive on the ranch road, 2 fingers on the wheel, the other hand resting easy like we had all the time in the world. We did not, but it felt that way. We replaced fence posts after school, counted calves in the dark with breath like steam. That land is not just dirt. It is a ledger of every back we ever broke and every prayer we ever whispered. When business got rough in the early years, the ranch carried me. When the business took off, the ranch reminded me not to get loud about it. You do not brag to land. You respect it. I thought marriage worked the same way. Quiet care, steady hands. Then one day the wind shifted. The house felt colder, and the porch light did not mean welcome anymore. I never imagined the day that the word marriage would feel like a courtroom word, or that her pen would stop writing stories about us and start tallying mine. Our first house had squeaky floors and a faucet that groaned like an old man, but it was ours. Friday nights were pizza on paper plates and road maps for the future spread across the table. Karen used to ask about crews and clients and laugh when I tracked mud inside. When the company got its first big commercial job, she kissed me on the driveway and told me not to forget who I was. I promised I would not. We did not take vacations much. Where does that to you? But we took drives out to the ranch and planned things we could not afford yet. She liked the porch. I liked how the silence let me hear my father's voice. Those were good years. I missed a few dinners. She forgave me. She missed a few Sundays. I forgave her. That is marriage. I thought you hold each other up. You do not keep score. I was so certain of that rule, I did not notice when someone quietly started keeping score. It started small. She asked about a skid steer like it was a new word she had heard on the radio. Then she asked what a dozer cost to run. Harmless, I figured. Everyone gets curious. But the tone changed. It became less about how my day was and more about what the day was worth. She wanted numbers, not stories. She asked how much cash sits in the business account during slow months and how many machines are owned free and clear. I'm a straightforward man. I do not speak in riddles, and I do not hide my ledgers. But even a straight man can feel when a question has a hook in it. I told myself marriage deserves trust. I told myself not to build walls where none were needed. But I also told myself something my dad once said while tightening a fence line. Good hearts still check the posts. That night, while locking up the shop, I realized I'd started checking the posts, and I did not like where my hands were pulling. I was on site at a mall project, sun bouncing off sheet metal when she called. She asked how I depreciate excavators. Her voice was bright like someone ordering a latte. I could hear rebar clanging and a crew chief shouting for the breaker. I told her it was about 40 grand a year per machine and asked why she wanted to know. She laughed it off, saying she was just trying to understand my world better. The call ended, and I stood there with my hard hat crooked and something bitter rising in my throat. In 20 years, Karen never asked about depreciation schedules. She asked if I was safe, if I needed dinner, if the crew needed cold water. I told myself to focus. We had a problem layer under the soil and a deadline that did not care about my marriage. But when a young operator asked me what to do next, I heard my own voice giving orders, but underneath it, another voice asked who taught my wife that question. That night, the house smelled like garlic, and the evening news was playing softly. Karen had a yellow notepad by the cutting board, lines of neat handwriting, dates, job names, numbers with dollar signs. I asked what the notebook was for, gentle as I could. She said she was learning. She said she had been married to me half my life, and maybe it was time she understood the business. On paper, that sounded fair. In practice, it felt like a stranger in my pantry. I kept my voice calm, explained project cycles, tried to turn it into a marriage moment instead of a cross-examination. She nodded a lot, but her eyes were somewhere else, counting something I could not see. Later, I sat in the truck with the dome light on and tried to pray. The words came out tight. My father used to say, "A house knows when it is loved." That kitchen felt like it was holding its breath. I told myself to be patient. The notepad told me to be careful. Friday night, the guys came over. In Texas, you talk life over smoke and meat. Tony flipped ribs. Bill brought a cooler and a banker's caution. Conversation drifted into wives, sons, busted knuckles, and interest rates. I mentioned Karen's new questions, kept it light. Tony stopped seasoning mid-shake. He told me his ex started asking about equipment values before she left. He thought she finally cared about what he did. Turns out her lawyer cared. Bill set down his drink and asked if I wanted him to look at how my accounts were structured, just to make sure I was protected. I waved it off. Pride is a loud thing, but their faces did not change. Men who have lived a little know the look of a storm on the horizon. When the coals settled and the laughter thinned, Tony clapped my shoulder and told me to trust but verify. I went home smelling like smoke and worry, and the porch light did not feel like a welcome sign anymore. A week later, I doubled back to grab blueprints I had left at home. The house was quiet in that heavy afternoon way. I pushed open my office door and saw Karen at the filing cabinet, phone tilted, the screen reflecting a contract header I knew by heart. I asked what she was doing. She flinched like I had caught a thief, then forced a smile. She said she was looking for tax documents to organize them. I told her taxes were in the safe, and they always had been. She shrugged, kept her eyes on the phone, and told me not to be paranoid. I stood there in my own office, feeling like a guest in a room I built. Listening to the soft click of her camera, something hard settled in my chest. That night, we lay in the same bed and stared at different ceilings. By morning, my mind was made up. If someone was counting my life by pages and photos, it was time I counted my moves. That night, we lay back to back like strangers renting the same room. I could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning and the ice maker drop a cube in the kitchen. Little domestic sounds that used to calm me now felt like a house clearing its throat, waiting to speak. I watched the numbers change on the clock and counted the years we had shared. Holidays, busted pipes, good news said at midnight with our feet touching. I wanted to roll over and ask if we were okay, but the question died in my chest. A man learns to read silence like weather. This was the sky going dark at noon. I thought about my father, how he would sit on the edge of the bed and lace his boots slow when something was on his mind. By 3 a.m, I was sitting like that. I told myself I would stop guessing and start doing. Morning would not find me unprepared. If trust was a fence, I was checking every post. The betrayal did not stop at the kitchen table. It had roots that went deeper than my marriage. At the weekly planning meeting, Derek leaned back in his chair, laced his fingers, and asked in a tone I had never heard from him about the cash flow for the next quarter. He had always cared about drawings, deadlines, the feel of a beam settling right. Money talk lived on my side of the table. I told him it was solid and asked why. He shrugged like it was nothing, just making sure we could cover materials if banks tightened. He smiled, but not with his eyes. I nodded, made a note I did not need to make, and felt the air shift between us. Maybe I was seeing ghosts. Maybe I was finally seeing clearly. After the meeting, I stood by the window and watched him leave, phone already at his ear, his truck door slamming like a period at the end of a sentence. I checked a few more posts that afternoon. Passwords, backups, access logs. I slept even less that night. Something was coming. I could feel it. 2 days later, I doubled back to the office for a roll of blueprints. Derek's truck was still in the lot after dark. The building hummed the way buildings do when only the machines are awake. I unlocked the back door and heard his voice through the half-closed office door. He was saying that the equipment valuations were in the files he showed her. He said the real money was in long-term contracts and bonding capacity. My hand froze on the doorknob. There was a pause. Then he said once they had the client list, they could underbid him on everything. Him, not us. My chest went cold. He laughed and said Ethan trusts people, and that is his weakness. Paper rustled. My name sounded wrong in his mouth. I stepped back on instinct like a deer feeling a twig snap. Quiet as I came, I left, heart kicking hard against the folder under my arm. By the time I hit the parking lot, my hand was shaking. I sat in my truck with the engine off, the cab dark, replaying Derek's words like a bad song stuck on repeat. Client list, bonding capacity, underbid him. I had spent years teaching him how we win work the right way. Shake hands, do the job, earn the next one. Now he was using my own playbook against me. I scrolled through my phone and found emails he had sent late at night, attachments I had not noticed before, contracts, bid histories. It was not proof by itself, but it lined up with what I heard through that half-open door. I pictured our clients, men who trusted the steady, not the slick, and my stomach turned. Betrayal has a strange taste. It is metallic, like you bit your tongue and did not know it. I told myself to breathe. Then I did what builders do. Assess, plan, act. Step 1, lock down access. Step 2, document everything. Step 3, stop giving benefit of the doubt to someone who took it like a gift. I pulled onto the highway, the kind of Texas night where the sky looks bigger than your problems. Derek's laugh would not leave my head. Ethan trusts people. Always has. That is his weakness. Trust has built more for me than it has ever broken. But he was not wrong about one thing. I give people room. My father told me once that a good man's rope is long, but it still has an end. I had reached mine. I thought about the day Derek joined me, fresh out of a bad firm, eyes hungry to build something honest. We stood on a slab and talked about earning respect instead of buying it. Where did that man go? I tightened my grip on the wheel and felt the Ford keys bite my palm. The road hummed. Somewhere between the exit signs and the cattle guards, I made a quiet promise. If trust was my weakness, clarity would be my strength. No more guessing. No more hoping. Time to see the picture in hard light. I parked in my driveway and just sat there, fingers shaking against the leather, watching my porch lights spill onto the steps. It was not fear. It was grief. Not the funeral kind. The kind where a door to your own house feels like it belongs to someone else. I try to catalog the hits. A wife counting my life in dollar signs. A partner carving my business with a smile. Betrayal comes as a pair because one by itself lets you shrug it off. 2 cuts teach you that you've been standing with your back too wide open. I remembered the early days. Cold coffee, hot concrete, payroll, and a rubber band. And what I loved most, certainty. You pour it sets. You weld it holds. People are not like that. I rubbed my hands together to steady them and realized this was the first time in years I had come home and not felt safe. I shut off the engine. The house was waiting. So was the decision I had already made. The next morning, I woke up with the strangest sensation of calm. It was the kind of calm a soldier feels when he stops worrying about the war and starts focusing on the weapon in his hands. I lay there for a moment, listening to the rhythm of Karen's breathing beside me, realizing that the person I had shared a bed with for 2 decades was now a combatant. I got up at 5:30, just like always. I made the coffee, strong and black, and poured 2 mugs. When Karen walked into the kitchen, wrapped in her silk robe, I did not ask who she had been texting at midnight. Instead, I kissed her on the forehead and told her the coffee was fresh. I played the part of the tired, oblivious husband perfectly. I complained about my back. I grumbled about a supplier in Houston who was late with a steel delivery. I watched her eyes light up with a subtle, predatory gleam. She liked hearing that I was struggling. It confirmed her narrative that I was losing my grip, that the business was faltering, and that the time to strike was now. I drove to the city, but I did not go to the job site. I went to a building downtown that smelled of old mahogany and expensive advice. Robert Hayes was not a strip mall lawyer. He was a Texas institution, a man who had been protecting ranch land and oil money since before I was born. He sat behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single oak tree, listening to me lay out the betrayal. I told him about the photos, the hidden folder, the depreciation questions, and Derek's plan to underbid me with my own data. I told him they wanted the company, the cash, and the ranch. Robert did not gasp. He did not offer sympathy. He simply steepled his fingers and told me that if they wanted a war of attrition, we would give them a scorched earth instead. Robert explained the strategy in a voice that sounded like gravel crunching under tires. He told me that Texas is a community property state, which meant they could come after everything acquired during the marriage unless we proved it was separate or protected. He drew 2 boxes on a legal pad. One he labeled operations. The other he labeled holdings. He told me that right now, my company was a single, vulnerable target. If they hit it, they took everything. The goal was to separate the value from the risk. We would move the heavy iron, the excavators, the dozers, the cranes, and the real estate into a new entity called Walker Holdings. The existing company, Walker Construction, would become nothing more than a shell that leased the equipment. Walker Construction would own the contracts, the liability, and the payroll, but would own absolutely nothing of tangible value. I asked him if this was legal, if a judge would see it as hiding assets. Robert smiled, a dry, thin expression. He told me it was not hiding, it was restructuring for liability protection, a standard business move for a company of my size. We would backdate the intent to a board meeting from 6 months ago, a meeting I had actually held with myself in my notebook regarding asset protection. The timing was tight, but it was defensible. Then, we would place the ranch into an irrevocable family trust. I would be the trustee, but I would not technically be the owner. The trust would have strict rules about bloodline inheritance. It would ensure that the land could never be sold or divided in a divorce settlement. It was a poison pill wrapped in a legal deed. I spent the next 3 days signing my name until my hand cramped. We transferred titles. We filed deeds. We set up lease agreements where Walker Construction agreed to pay Walker Holdings monthly fees for the use of the equipment. These fees were high enough to drain the cash flow of the construction company, making it look less profitable on paper. If Karen and Derek succeeded in taking over the business, they would inherit a company with massive overhead, no assets, and a landlord, me, who could call on the equipment leases at any moment. I was building a trapdoor beneath their feet, and they were too busy measuring the curtains to notice the floor was hollow. But a strategy on paper is different from reality on the ground. I needed to know how deep the rot went with Derek. I needed to see if he was just greedy or if he was actively sabotaging the work we had right now. I drove out to the mall project on a Tuesday afternoon. It was 90 degrees in the shade, and the air was thick with the smell of diesel and curing concrete. I parked my truck on the ridge overlooking the site, far enough away to be just another white Ford in Texas. I pulled out my binoculars and watched. Derek was down in the pit with the foundation crew. We were scheduled to pour the main slab for the anchor tenant in 2 days. It was a massive pour, 300 yards of concrete that had to be perfect. I watched as Derek waved off the soil compaction testing team. I saw him argue with the foreman, pointing at his watch. He was skipping the final density test. Any builder knows that if you pour on soft ground, the slab cracks within a year. It is not a question of if, but when. I lowered the binoculars, feeling a sick knot form in my stomach. Derek was not just cutting corners. He was building a failure. He wanted the project to have issues. Delays and repairs would burn cash, lowering the company's valuation just in time for the divorce proceedings. He was willing to destroy our reputation to save a few dollars on the settlement price. My instinct was to drive down there, fire him on the spot, and order the test myself. Every fiber of my being wanted to save the job. But Robert's voice echoed in my head. He had told me that to win the war, I might have to lose a battle. I needed proof of his negligence. I needed to show that he was breaching his fiduciary duty to the company. If I stopped him now, it was just an argument. If I let him do it, it was cause for termination for cause, which would trigger the buyout clause in our partnership agreement at a significantly reduced rate. I picked up my phone and started recording. I zoomed in on Derek dismissing the testers. I recorded the timestamp. I recorded him signing the daily log, falsely checking the box that said soil inspection complete. It felt like watching someone key my own car, but I kept the camera steady. I let him dig his own grave. I knew I would have to fix it later, that I would have to spend my own money to inject stabilizers under that slab to save it. But for now, I needed the evidence more than I needed the concrete. That evening, I went home with the weight of the secret pressing on my lungs. Karen was in the living room, looking over color swatches for a renovation she was planning. She asked me how the mall project was going. I told her it was tough, that we were behind schedule and bleeding money. I told her I was worried we might not make the margins I had hoped for. I watched her try to hide a smile. She offered me a glass of wine and told me not to worry so much, that things have a way of working themselves out. She sounded like a comforting wife, but I knew she was calculating how much cheaper my share of the company would be if the project tanked. I decided to feed their confidence. I left a draft document on the kitchen counter the next morning, buried under a stack of mail. It was a preliminary valuation of the company that I had prepared for the bank, but I had adjusted the numbers. It showed the equipment value as depreciated to almost nothing and the projected liabilities as massive. I knew she would find it. I knew she would take a picture of it and send it to Derek. I wanted them to think I was broke. I wanted them to think the fruit was hanging so low they did not need a ladder. A few days later, Derek walked into my office. He looked confident, almost cocky. He asked me about the soil reports for the mall. I looked him dead in the eye and lied. I told him I trusted his judgment and that I was sure he had handled it. He nodded a little too quickly and told me everything was perfect. He said we were going to make a record profit. I watched him lie to my face without blinking. We had built this company from a single pickup truck, sharing gas station sandwiches and dreams of the skyline. Now, he was looking at me like I was an obstacle to be removed. I signed the payroll checks he handed me, keeping my hands steady. That afternoon, I met Robert again to finalize the trust documents for the ranch. He slid the papers across the desk. The deed transfer was irrevocable. Once I signed, the ranch would belong to the Walker Family Trust. I would lose personal ownership, but I would gain absolute protection. I picked up the pen. My grandfather's face flashed in my mind, sun-beaten and stern. He never trusted banks, and he never trusted lawyers, but he trusted land. I was doing this to save the only thing he truly cared about. I signed my name. The ink looked black and permanent. Robert notarized it with a heavy thud of his stamp. That sound was the first shot fired in my counterattack. I drove back to the ranch that night. The sun was setting, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. I sat on the porch and looked out at the miles of fence line. I knew that in a few weeks, Karen would serve me with divorce papers. She would come with her lawyers and her demands, thinking she held all the cards. She would think she was taking half of a thriving empire. She did not know she was about to fight for half of a ghost. I had moved the soul of the business into a fortress she could not breach. I sipped my whiskey and waited for the night to settle. The trap was set. Now, I just had to wait for them to step into it. The hardest part was not the legal maneuvering. It was the waiting. It was waking up every day next to a woman who was plotting my ruin and smiling back at her, knowing that I was the one holding the detonator. Living with a spy in your own house changes the way you walk through a room. For 3 weeks, I moved through my life like an actor on a stage where the audience wanted to see a tragedy. I had to be the man they expected me to be, tired, distracted, and slowly losing his grip on the empire he had built. Every morning, I woke up next to Karen, The woman who was currently texting my business partner about how best to dismantle me, and I asked her how she slept. I drank the coffee she poured, knowing she was likely checking my phone logs while I was in the shower. It was a performance that required a discipline I did not know I possessed, a discipline harder than any foundation pour in the dead of winter. I had to let them believe they were winning so that they would stop looking for the knife I had hidden in my boot. The strategy Robert and I had devised relied entirely on their arrogance. We needed them to believe that Walker Construction was a sinking ship, heavy with debt and light on cash. If they thought the company was failing, they would not look too closely at where the assets had gone. They would assume the missing value was simply lost to bad management and the market downturn I was fabricating. To sell this lie, I had to feed them evidence. I became a master of the calculated mistake. I left a confidential letter from the bank on the kitchen island, one that detailed the denial for a line of credit extension. I had drafted it myself on my laptop, printed it on official-looking stock, and crumpled it slightly as if in frustration. When I came home that evening, the letter had been moved just an inch to the left. Karen had seen it. She had likely photographed it. I sat on the couch and put my head in my hands, letting out a heavy sigh for good measure. She rubbed my back and told me it would be okay, her voice dripping with a sympathy that felt like ice water. At the office, the game was even more dangerous. Derek was becoming sloppy, his caution eroding under the weight of his greed. He stopped hiding his phone when I walked in. He started leaving early on Fridays. He was already spending the money he thought he was about to steal. I watched him order a new truck, a $70,000 distinct upgrade on the company account. Normally, I would have stormed into his office and demanded an explanation. Instead, I signed the purchase order with a shaky hand, muttering about how we needed to project strength to the clients. Derek smirked as he walked away. He thought I was desperate to keep up appearances. He did not realize I was letting him load the company with liabilities that he would soon be responsible for. Every dollar he spent was a dollar less I would have to fight for in court. I was letting him rob an empty vault. Then came the move I had been waiting for, the move that almost stopped my heart despite all my preparation. It was a Tuesday, a week before the filing date. I was at a site inspection for a new school district project when my phone buzzed with a notification from a bank. Access denied. I tried to log into the main operating account for Walker Construction. Locked. A moment later, Robert called. He told me that Karen's lawyer had filed an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order on all marital assets, claiming that I was mismanaging funds and putting the marital estate at risk. She had used the denied credit letter I planted as proof of my financial instability. They had convinced a judge to freeze the accounts to stop me from hiding more money. For a split second, the old panic flared up. A frozen account means missed payroll. Missed payroll means the crews walk. If the crews walk, the jobs stop, and the reputation I built over 20 years evaporates in an afternoon. But then I remembered the timeline. I took a breath and leaned against the hood of my truck, watching the wind ripple through the high grass. We had anticipated this. In fact, we had counted on it. Robert had warned me that once they smelled blood, they would try to stop the bleeding to save their share. I had moved the liquidity 48 hours ago. It was a perfectly legal transfer, categorized as prepaid equipment lease obligations from Walker Construction to Walker Holdings. The operating company, the one they had just frozen, held exactly enough cash to cover the checks I had already written and the payroll for this week, plus a few $1,000s in float. The real war chest, the accumulated profits of the last 5 years, was sitting safely in the accounts of Walker Holdings, an entity that was not named in the restraining order because, technically, it was a vendor, not a marital asset they knew how to target yet. They had frozen a puddle while I had moved the lake. I drove to the bank anyway, playing the part of the outraged husband. I yelled at the branch manager, a man I had known for 10 years, putting on a show for the security cameras and anyone watching. I demanded to know why my cards were not working. I called Karen, leaving a frantic voicemail asking what she had done. I needed her to feel powerful. I needed her to think she had caught me off guard. When I got home that night, she was waiting in the living room, sitting tall, her face a mask of practiced sorrow. She told me she had no choice. that she had to protect our future from my reckless spending. She said she was filing for divorce to save what was left. I looked at her, and for the first time, I did not have to act. The sadness I felt was real, not for the money, but for the absolute death of the history between us. I looked at the woman who had once helped me count change for pizza and saw a stranger who would starve me to feed her own ambition. I nodded, accepted the service papers from the process server who stepped out of the shadows of my own porch, and walked past her to the guest room. The next few days were a blur of legal maneuvering that I watched from a distance. The court date was set. The asset freeze remained in place on the operating account, which was slowly choking the shell company just as I had designed. I let the invoices pile up on my desk. I let the suppliers call and complain about late payments. I forwarded every angry email to Derek, asking him to handle it because my hands were tied by the court order. I watched the stress begin to fracture his composure. He had expected to inherit a gold mine, but he was currently sitting on a pile of overdue bills and angry vendors. He started arguing with Karen on the phone in hushed tones behind his closed door. He wanted to know why there was no cash. She told him it was there, just frozen. They reassured each other that once the decree was signed, the ice would melt and they would be rich. They had no idea the ice was the only thing holding the structure together. I spent the weekend before the court date at the ranch. I needed to walk the fence line one last time as Ethan Walker, the owner, before I fully embraced my role as Ethan Walker, the trustee. The legal transfer was complete, recorded in the county clerk's office 3 counties away, buried in a stack of filings that no one had bothered to check because they were too busy staring at the frozen bank accounts in Austin. I rode my horse out to the Western Ridge, the place where my grandfather had first camped in '52. The land looked the same as it always had, harsh, beautiful, and indifferent to the petty wars of men. I sat there and thought about the concept of ownership. Karen thought ownership was a piece of paper, a title, a number in a bank account. She did not understand that you cannot own something you do not know how to bleed for. She wanted the ranch because it was worth money. I kept the ranch because it was the keeper of my blood. I realized then that I wasn't stealing anything from her. I was preventing a theft. If she got this land, she would sell it to developers within a year. She would turn this ridge into a subdivision of cookie-cutter houses. Protecting it wasn't just about spite. It was about stewardship. I made peace with my actions on that ridge. I was not the villain of this story, no matter what her lawyer would say in court. I was the firewall. I drove back to the city on Sunday night, the skyline glowing purple in the distance. My phone buzzed with a text from Tony, my foreman. He asked if we were going to be okay for the Monday pour, considering the rumors about the bank freeze. I texted him back 2 words, "Trust me." It was a heavy request. I was asking 45 men to walk into a fire with me, betting their livelihoods on a game of 3-dimensional chess I couldn't explain to them yet. But I knew that if this worked, I could take care of them better than before. If it failed, we would all go down. I walked into my house, or what was legally still our house, and found the living room filled with boxes. Karen was packing. Not moving out, but packing my things. She had already decided that when the judge ruled, I would be the one leaving. She had labeled a box Ethan's office. It sat by the door like trash waiting for pickup. I stared at that box, at the books and framed photos she had tossed inside, and felt a cold, hard resolve settle in my gut like concrete curing. She had already evicted me in her mind. She had already spent the money. She had already erased me. I went to the safe in a master closet, the one she thought contained only the old tax return she had photographed. I dialed the combination and opened the heavy steel door. Inside, underneath the decoy papers, was a single manila folder. It contained the certified trust deeds, the equipment leaseback agreements, the forensic report of Derek's sabotage, and the photos of their affair. I took the folder out and held it. It wasn't heavy, but it carried the weight of a collapsing star. I closed the safe and locked it. I didn't need to hide anymore. The time for hiding was over. The imitating was done. Tomorrow, we would stand in front of a judge, and I would finally stop pretending to be the victim. Tomorrow, I would show them the difference between a husband who surrendered and a builder who has simply been clearing the site for new construction. I walked into the bedroom, laid the folder on the nightstand next to my side of the bed, and for the first time in months, I slept without dreaming. The blueprint was drawn. The materials were staged. All that was left was to pour the truth and watch it set. The courtroom in downtown Austin felt less like a hall of justice and more like a surgical theater where my life was scheduled for amputation. The air was cold, recycled, and smelled faintly of floor wax and anxious sweat. I walked in with Robert at my shoulder, carrying nothing but a battered leather briefcase and the calm of the man who has already walked through the fire. Karen was already there, sitting at the plaintiff's table. She wore a black dress that was modest enough for a judge, but sharp enough to signal victory. Her chin was high, her shoulders square. She did not look at me. Beside her sat her lawyer, a man named Walsh who wore a suit that cost more than my first truck and had a smile that did not reach his eyes. In the gallery behind them, Derek sat with his arms crossed, wearing a tie that was too bright for a Tuesday morning. He looked like a man waiting for a prize fight to end in a first-round knockout. I took my seat and arranged my pens on the table with deliberate slowness. I watched the clock on the wall, the second hand sweeping past the numbers, chopping away the last moments of the life I used to know. Robert leaned in and whispered something I didn't need to hear, but I nodded anyway. We had a script. We had a sequence. And we had the absolute certainty that comes from knowing exactly where the landmines are buried, because you're the one who dug the holes. When the bailiff called the case, the room stood as one body, then sat like a machine that knew its parts. The judge was an older man with a face like a dried riverbed, lines etched deep by years of listening to people lie to him. He looked at the files, then at us, with a weary expectation of drama. Walsh rose first. He did not speak. He performed. He paced the floor, painting a picture of a marriage where Karen was the silent architect of my success. He claimed she had sacrificed her career, nurtured the home, and supported the business from the shadows. He argued that the company, the machinery, the contracts, and the ranch were all community property, fruits of a shared labor. He presented a valuation of Walker Construction that was 6 months old, a number that sparkled with millions of dollars in equity. He demanded 50% of the company, immediate liquidation of assets to cover a cash settlement, and a partition of the ranch to be sold for development. He spoke with the confidence of a man holding 4 aces, unaware that we were playing chess, not poker. I watched Karen while he spoke. She maintained a perfect mask of tragic necessity, nodding slightly at the descriptions of her sacrifice. She believed every word. She believed she was owed the sweat off my back and the dirt under my fingernails. She had convinced herself that her betrayal was actually justice. Derek in the back could barely sit still. I could see him tapping his foot, checking his watch, calculating the moment he could walk out of here and claim his half of the kingdom. They were so busy counting the harvest, they didn't notice the field had been salted. When Walsh finished, the room fell silent, waiting for the fight. The judge turned to Robert and asked if we contested the division of assets as presented by the plaintiff. This was the moment. This was the pivot point. Robert stood up, buttoned his jacket, and in a voice devoid of emotion, stated that we did not contest the division. We agreed to the 50-50 split of the operating entity known as Walker Construction. We agreed to the dissolution. We agreed to the timeline. A ripple of confusion moved through the room like a draft. Walsh frowned, checking his notes, wondering if he had misheard. Karen turned to look at me for the first time, her brow furrowed. She had expected a war. She had prepared for screaming, for delays, for me to fight for every inch of ground. My surrender didn't make sense to her. It was too easy. The judge looked at me, his eyes narrowing, looking for the angle, for the trick. He asked me directly if I understood what I was agreeing to. I stood up and looked him in the eye. I told him I understood perfectly. I told him I wanted to be fair. I told him I wanted to give my wife exactly what she asked for. The judge nodded slowly, reaching for his gavel to formalize the order. Walsh relaxed, a smug grin spreading across his face. Derek let out a breath in the back row, a sound of pure relief. They thought it was over. They thought they had won. But just as the judge's hand moved, Robert raised a finger. One small, polite interruption. He stated that for the sake of the court's record and to ensure strict compliance with the order, we needed to submit the current certified asset schedules for the entities being divided, just so there would be no confusion during the transfer. I opened my briefcase. I took out the manila folder. It wasn't thick, but it was dense. I walked it to the bailiff, who handed it up to the bench. The room went quiet in that deep, heavyweight rooms do when the air pressure drops before a tornado. I returned to my seat and waited. The judge opened the folder. He adjusted his glasses. He began to read. The first document was the certified balance sheet of Walker Construction, the operating company that Karen had just one half of. The judge's eyes scanned the columns. He saw the equipment lease obligations. He saw the payroll liabilities. He saw the vendor debt. He saw that the company had zero tangible assets and a monthly burn rate that exceeded its revenue, thanks to the equipment rental fees payable to Walker Holdings. The company was technically insolvent, a shell that existed only to pay bills and manage liability. He flipped the page. The next document was the deed to the Walker Family Trust. He read the legal description of the ranch, the land my grandfather staked. He saw the date of the transfer, executed and recorded perfectly in accordance with state law, placing the land into an irrevocable trust for the benefit of bloodline descendants, removing it entirely from the marital estate. He saw the clause that designated me as the trustee with sole discretion over the property. The ranch was not mine to give, and therefore not hers to take. Then he reached the back of the folder. The forensic report on Derek. The judge paused. He looked at the photos of his sabotage at the mall project. He looked at the text messages between Karen and Derek discussing the plan to devalue the company. He looked at the bank records showing Derek's unauthorized spending. He saw the proof that the very value they were fighting for had been systematically destroyed by their own hands. The silence in the room stretched until it hummed. I saw the judge's face harden. He was an old Texas jurist. He knew the law, but more importantly, he knew the difference between a victim and a grifter. He looked up from the folder and stared at Walsh. Then he looked at Karen. The warmth was gone from his eyes. He realized he had almost been used as a weapon in a robbery. He spoke to the record, his voice flat and dangerous. He noted that the assets in question, the heavy machinery and the real estate, were held by separate legal entities that were not part of the divorce petition. He noted that the operating company, of which the plaintiff demanded half, appeared to be significantly encumbered by debt and lease obligations. He looked at Karen and stated that the court would grant her request. She would receive 50% of the stock in Walker Construction. She would assume 50% of its liabilities. She would be entitled to 50% of its profits, of which there were currently none. Karen's face went the color of old paper. She looked at Walsh, who was frantically flipping through his own copies of the documents, realizing too late that he had been looking at a map while I was changing the territory. He started to stammer, to object, to claim that the assets had been moved fraudulently. But the judge cut him off. He held up the trust deed. He pointed to the dates. Everything had been done legally, openly, and prior to the filing. More importantly, he held up the forensic report. He stated that if there was any fraud, it appeared to be the conspiracy between the plaintiff and a third party to manipulate the business value, a fact that made my protective measures not only legal but necessary for the survival of the business. The gavel didn't bang. It fell with a final, hollow thud. The order was entered. Karen had won. She was now the proud owner of half a company that owed money to a holding company I controlled. She had won the right to pay half the debts. She had won absolutely nothing of the ranch. I turned to look at the gallery. Derek was frozen, his mouth slightly open, the blood drained from his face. He understood the math instantly. He knew the lease agreements on the trucks and excavators were callable on demand. He knew that without the equipment, the contracts he planned to steal were worthless. He knew that he was not walking out of here a millionaire. He was walking out of here unemployed and likely facing a lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty. I stood up. I buttoned my jacket. I did not smile. There is no joy in destroying the people you once trusted, only a grim satisfaction in survival. I looked at Karen. She was staring at the table, her hands trembling, the realization of her total defeat crashing down on her. She had gambled her marriage, her history, and her integrity on a payday that was never coming. I walked past her table without a word. I walked past Derek, who shrank back into his seat as if afraid I might hit him. I didn't need to hit him. I had already demolished the ground he stood on. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom and stepped out into the hallway. The air was still cool, but the smell of floor wax was gone, replaced by the scent of freedom. Robert walked beside me, closing his briefcase with a sharp click. We didn't high-five. We didn't celebrate. We just walked to the elevator, two men who had done the necessary, ugly work of cleaning up a mess. The elevator doors opened, and we stepped inside. As the doors slid shut, cutting off the view of the courtroom, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding for 40 days. The war was over. The structure had held. Now, all that was left was to sweep up the debris. The silence after a storm is always heavier than the wind that caused it. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt a strange kind of hollowness, not from loss, but from the sudden absence of the weight I had been carrying for months. The sun hit the pavement with the same intensity as any other Tuesday in Texas, but the world looked different. It looked cleaner. I watched Karen and Derek exit the building 10 minutes after I did. They walked apart, separated by a few feet of concrete and a chasm of realization. They were no longer partners in a grand heist. They were co-owners of a disaster. I did not stop to gloat. I got in my truck, turned the key, and drove back to the one place that still made sense. Work. The execution of the final phase began the next morning at 8 o'clock sharp. I sat in my office, the office that technically belonged to a company now half-owned by my ex-wife, and signed the notices from Walker Holdings. As the owner of the holding company, I was officially terminating the equipment leases with Walker Construction due to uncertainty regarding the lessee's solvency. It was a ruthless move, legal and binding. Within an hour, every excavator, dozer, and crane on our job sites was legally grounded. The operating company, the prize Karen had fought so hard to split, was instantly paralyzed. It had contracts it could not fulfill and payroll it could not meet, all while carrying the debt of the lease penalties I had just enforced. Derek arrived at the yard shortly after 9. He tried to swipe his key card at the gate, but the light stayed red. I had revoked his access the moment the judge signed the order. I watched from the window as he argued with the security guard, a man who had worked for me for 15 years and knew exactly where his loyalty lay. Derek looked up at my window, his face twisted in a mix of rage and panic. He knew what was happening. He knew that the forensic report regarding the mall project was not just a courtroom prop. It was the gun I was about to put to his head. I met him in the conference room, flanked by 2 security officers. I did not speak to him as a friend or a partner. I handed him a termination letter for cause, citing gross negligence, breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy to devalue the company. I slid the buyout agreement across the table. It was not a negotiation. The value of his share in the partnership, after deducting the damages from the compromise slab and the unauthorized spending, came out to a negative number. I was offering to absolve him of the debt he owed the company in exchange for his immediate resignation and the surrender of his equity. He signed it. His hand shook, scratching his name across the paper that ended his career in this town. He walked out of the building with a cardboard box and the heavy knowledge that he had traded a brotherhood for a mirage. Karen's realization was slower, quieter, and far more painful. She called me 3 days later. I let it go to voicemail. She called again. I listened to the message in the dark of the ranch house. Her voice was thin, stripped of the arrogance she had worn in court. She asked about the bills. She asked why the bank accounts were still frozen. She asked how she was supposed to pay her legal fees when the company she now half-owned was generating zero revenue. I did not call her back. Instead, I had Robert send a formal offer. I would buy out her 50% interest in Walker Construction for a sum that was exactly enough to cover her lawyer's bill and a few months of rent. It was pennies on the dollar compared to what she had demanded, but it was the only life raft she was going to get. She held out for a week, hoping for a miracle, but miracles don't happen to people who build their houses on lies. She signed the papers on a Friday. The divorce was final. The partnership was dissolved. The house was sold, the proceeds split and swallowed by debts she had accrued. I moved full-time to the ranch, to the cabin my grandfather built. The rooms were smaller, the floors creaked, and the wind howled through the gaps in the logs. But for the first time in a year, I felt at home. Rebuilding the business was the easy part. I gathered the crew, the men who had poured concrete with me in the August heat, and told them the truth. I told them the company they worked for was changing, but the man they worked for was not. I formed a new operating entity, leased the equipment back from my holding company, and picked up the contracts right where we left off. We fixed the slab at the mall. We finished the school. We did it right, without cutting corners, and we did it under a name that no longer carried the weight of a broken marriage. The reputation of the Walker name survived because it was built on the work, not the letterhead. Months passed. The seasons turned, turning the green pastures of the ranch to a dormant gold. I spent my evenings on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, listening to the coyotes sing to the moon. I thought about the nature of revenge. People think it is about inflicting pain, about making the other person bleed. But true revenge, the kind that settles your soul, is simply refusing to be destroyed. It is standing still when they expect you to fall. It is keeping the light on when they try to leave you in the dark. Karen moved to Dallas, chasing a new start in a city that didn't know her story. Derek left the state entirely. Rumor had it he was working sales for a lumber yard in Oklahoma. They became ghosts, fading into the background of a life they tried to hijack. I didn't hate them anymore. Hate takes energy, and I had concrete to pour. I viewed them like I viewed a structural failure in a building, a weakness that had been exposed and removed so the rest of the edifice could stand. One evening, I rode out to the fence line my father and I had repaired a lifetime ago. The cedar posts were gray with age, but they stood straight. The wire was tight. I ran my gloved hand along the top strand, feeling the tension that held the boundary. My father used to say that a fence is a promise. It keeps in what you value and keeps out what would ruin it. I had spent 20 years thinking that promise was about the land. I finally understood it was about the soul. I had built a fortress not out of stone, but out of integrity and foresight. I had protected the legacy not just for myself, but for the idea that honest work deserves to be defended. I looked back at the cabin, the yellow light of the kitchen spilling out onto the porch. It was just me now. The silence was absolute, but it wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. I had lost a wife. I had lost a friend. I had lost the version of the future I once thought was inevitable. But I looked down at my hands, the hands that knew the difference between a good weld and a bad one, and I knew I had won the only thing that mattered. I was still the owner of my history. I was still the trustee of this land. And when the sun came up tomorrow, I would put my boots on, drink my coffee, and go to work. The storm had passed. The debris was cleared, and I was still standing.